Hi everyone, this is Amy Johnson Crow, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week we are going to tackle Don't Be Scared of Cemeteries. I know a lot of people who aren't involved in genealogy and family history are a little hesitant about cemeteries. They find them to be scary or spooky, but when you're into genealogy and you're doing family history, cemeteries are wonderful places. They can give us so much information, and that's what we're going to talk about today, are all of the great things that you can find in cemeteries. As I just said, cemeteries aren't creepy for genealogists. In fact, they are some of my favorite places. I've joked before that I don't think that I've ever found a cemetery that I didn't like. I've been known to spend entire days in cemeteries, even if it's a cemetery where I don't have anyone buried. So, yeah, if you can't find me, go to the cemetery. That's probably where I am. But cemeteries are wonderful for us in genealogy because they are filled with all sorts of genealogical and biographical information. And cemeteries also give us good clues for further research. We just have to pay attention so that we can pick up on those clues. So when you're at the cemetery and you're looking at tombstones, or if you've gone to the cemetery office and you've received records, make sure that you glean everything you can from that information, because you never know what little nugget is going to give you that information later, what question that information is going to help answer later on in your research. So obviously we think of names, but we also want to pay a lot of attention to dates and relationships. Pay very careful attention to the epitaph that's on the tombstone. You can get a lot of information from that, as well as context. And we're going to be talking about context in just a little bit. You'll see a little bit more what I mean about that. And also, when you're looking at that tombstone, pay attention to the symbols. There can be a lot of information that can lead you to further research just by looking at those symbols. So when we're at the cemetery, and let's say that we've come across a tombstone like this. This is one tombstone that has two individuals. It marks the graves of two individuals. The first with the name Our Baby Boy, and also Julia Graham. Now, it's important that we read the whole thing, because when we see Julia Graham, our first instinct is that that's her first name and her last name. But when we read the rest of the tombstone, and I'll concentrate here just on Julia's side, it says that Julia was born August of 1879 and died July 25th, 1880. So she's just a little under a year old when she died. And it notes down here at the bottom that this is the son and daughter of John and A. Pembleton. So Graham is not her last name. It's actually her middle name. So here we have an infant son. We have a young daughter, both of them the son and daughter of John and A. Pembleton. Now, what I would want to do when I come across this tombstone is to look around nearby and look for other Pembletons. It's very common for the parents to be buried near any of their children who predeceased them. So it's pretty likely that if I look around the cemetery that I will find John and A. Pembleton, so I can put the family back together. So make sure that you're reading that entire tombstone and getting all of those clues so that you don't jump to conclusions. Also, pay attention to the dates. Now, sometimes they're not going to be quite as spelled out as we would like. For example, this tombstone for John Watts, and his tombstone reads, died in the faith of the gospel, May the 3rd, 1847. And instead of giving his birth date, they did something that was very common in the 1800s, and that was just to list their exact age. So if I do just a little bit of math, I find that his birth date was approximately the 8th of June, 1775. Now, there is a little bit of math involved. You might not realize that when you first get involved in genealogy. Sometimes there is math, but it's really straightforward, and we can tell from the age and calculating it back from his date of death that he was born approximately June the 8th, 1775. And sometimes the dates will get a birth date and we'll get a death date, but sometimes, and this is especially common in tombstones starting in the 1900s, where we just have the years, such as this military marker for Forrest Belknap, and it gives his birth as 1897 and his death date as 1976. But I can still use that as a clue to get into other records that might give me a more specific date of death. In this case, I'm thinking that looking in the Social Security Death Index would be a good place to start to get a more specific date of death for Forrest Belknap. And also looking at the rest of his tombstone, I have a really great clue that I need to follow up on, noting that he was a private in the U.S. Army in World War I. So I should be looking at things like World War I draft cards and other military records related to World War I to see if I can find Forrest Belknap. Again, taking those clues right here from the tombstone. Now, when we think about epitaphs, we sometimes think of just those poetic epitaphs, that, as I am, so you will be, those types of things. But epitaphs can also be biographical, and we'll take a look at each type. Now, here is a beautiful old tombstone from 1840. And when you look at the epitaph that's carved in at the bottom, and I'll highlight that a little bit, where it has this beautiful poem, "This lovely bud, so young and fair, called hence by early doom, just came to show how sweet a flower in paradise would bloom." So that's very typical of the type of epitaph, a poetic epitaph, that we would see during the late 1700s and through the 1800s. Very poetic, sort of, I don't want to say melodramatic, but, very, very verbose, very flowery in the language. But what I like about this particular one is how it could give us a clue if we needed it to. Let's say that this tombstone, and I'll back up just a second. Let's say that this tombstone wasn't so legible and that we couldn't read the dates very clearly. But from this poem here in this epitaph, we would know that it was a young person who died. So that could give us a clue if we're trying to tell if this is the person we're looking for, or if this is, or if the person we're looking for died when they were quite elderly. This wouldn't be their tombstone. So we can get clues even out of poetic epitaphs. But don't think that all epitaphs are poems. This particular tombstone was quite difficult to read, but deciphering it was definitely worth the effort, because this long section here underneath the name Richard Thompson actually reads, "Born in Dublin, Ireland, served as a soldier in the English army for several years, came to America and served as drum major under General Washington, also under General Harrison in War of 1812. Died in the year 1836 in Delaware County, Ohio, aged 95 years. So it's not a poem, it's actually giving us some great biographical information about Richard Thompson. And you better believe that if this were somebody that I was researching, I would start following up on looking for Revolutionary War records as well as records from the War of 1812. Context. Context is so important no matter what type of record that we're looking at, because we need to be able to put that record and be able to tell how it compares with others. Is it typical? Is it atypical? What really is it telling us? And here I have two separate pictures that I took from a local cemetery. The first is the tombstone of Maudie Arneal, and the other is a picture I took of the tombstone of Thomas Arneal. And each of these individually gives me some information. Each of them has their full name, and it also has a year of birth and a year of death. So it is enough to get me started doing more research. I have places, at least I have a year now where I can start looking for some vital records. But if I take just a couple steps back, literally, and I get this picture, and I see that Maudie and Thomas are actually buried next to each other. So this makes me feel a little bit more confident that these two are related somehow, probably brother and sister, although I haven't confirmed that. But seeing them there buried next to each other, this photo gives me that context that I'm going to need later in my research. So I urge anyone, whenever you go to a cemetery, and chances are you have a digital camera now. I like to joke that with digital cameras, that film is cheap. Go ahead and take those pictures, take those wide shots, get that context. We get so excited when we find that tombstone we're looking for. Take a couple steps back and get that context so you can see what else is around. It could make a difference to your research. Just like we have here the case of J.E. Poole with a date of 1881. Now, is this a birth date? Is this a death date? Is this both? I don't know. But when I take a look at where J.E. Poole is buried, I see that he is buried in the lot for the Indianapolis Typographical Union. And doing a little bit of research, found that this union had bought a cemetery plot at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis and sold it to the families of people who were union members. And let's say that their families didn't have enough money to buy their own cemetery lot, that they could purchase one from the Indianapolis Typographical Union. So not only does this give me a little bit more information about J.E. Poole, but it also gives me something to follow up on. Should I be looking for the records of the Indianapolis Typographical Union? Again, it's all about getting context. Make sure that you always pay attention to whatever symbols are on that tombstone. Sometimes they are just symbols related to the belief in the afterlife, or a symbol of a life cut short. As we saw on that first tombstone that we looked at, you might have noticed that there was a rosebud that was broken, which symbolizes a life cut short, that this life had not yet bloomed and it's already broken. But sometimes we can get some very good clues to follow up on in our research. Now here we have a symbol that you might see, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And those are the three links. And sometimes they will have within it the letters F, L, and T. And sometimes you'll just see the three links. But what this is a symbol of is a fraternal organization called the Independent Order of Oddfellows, sometimes described as the Poor Man's Masons. And the FLT referred to their motto of friendship, love, and truth. So that's a very common symbol that you will see on tombstones, again, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But also look at what we have here underneath, the letters GAR, which stands for Grand Army of the Republic, which was an organization of Union veterans. So when I see this on a tombstone, I definitely want to follow up and find out more about that person's Civil War service. Sometimes symbols aren't exactly spelled out for us, but they can still give us a good clue, such as this one with the crossed flags is often used as a symbol of military service. Now, this particular tombstone didn't spell it out for us, but it's a really good clue. And if I was researching this person, I would definitely want to follow up to see if they had, in fact, served in the military. There are way too many symbols for me to go through today. We could literally spend the rest of the day talking about tombstone symbols. So if you come across one that you don't recognize, I suggest going on Google and doing a search for tombstone symbols or tombstone iconography. And I suggest that you do searches on both because you will get slightly different results. So again, going on Google and finding resources for tombstone symbols and tombstone iconography. There are some great resources out there with lots of symbols that can help you decipher the ones that you find in your local cemetery. If you're using tombstones for research, you need to evaluate that tombstone as a source. Now, I know a lot of times we think of sources as just being, paper or, records or databases or microfilm. It's something that has text on it. It's something that can be written on. But a tombstone really is just another type of source. And the thing to remember about sources is that the longer it takes to record something, the more likely there is to be an error. People's memory fades over time. So, dates could be off, a middle initial could be off. So the more likely, the longer that it took to erect that tombstone, the more likely there is to be an error. So how can we evaluate this? Well, we need to look at the tombstone itself. And does it seem appropriate to the time period? Is it the right type of stone? Is it in the right font? Is it the right type of letters? What about the wording? Are these things appropriate to the time period of when that person died? And that will help clue you in whether or not this tombstone was erected near the time that they died. So it's good to become familiar with the materials that have been used in tombstones. Now, in the United States, slate, limestone, and sandstone were popular through the mid-1800s. It was relatively cheap and it was very easy to carve, so it made slate, limestone, and sandstone very popular choices. Marble became popular during the mid-1800s. You might have seen some metal markers. Those are zinc or sometimes called white bronze markers, and those were made from 1875 to 1912. And how can I be so specific? There was one company who made them, and those were the years that they were in operation, 1875 to 1912. Gray granite became popular in the late 1800s. And then in the 1920s, colored granite came in vogue, and it continues to be the most popular material for tombstones today. So we see gray granite becoming popular in the late 1800s, and then colored granite, like your rose-colored granite or your black granite, becoming very popular in the 1920s and remaining popular today. Now, I mentioned the zinc or the white bronze markers. So I just wanted to throw this in as an example in case you're not familiar with them. They have this sort of bluish gray cast, and they really are metal. The letters are raised, and What's ironic is that a lot of cemeteries, when these were being produced, there were a lot of cemeteries who refused to allow them to be put up in their cemeteries. They thought that they looked cheap. What's ironic is that these tombstones are often more legible than some of the other tombstones that were put up at the same time. So these have actually stood the test of time, even though there were cemeteries who actually forbid them from being erected in that particular cemetery. Getting back to evaluating the tombstones, here's that tombstone that we saw earlier with John C. Cobble and had that beautiful poetic epitaph. And we see dates: born August 13th, 1838, died September 17th, 1840. And looking at this material, this tombstone is sandstone. And looking at the type of writing, looking at the font, and also looking at the very poetic epitaph, those are all consistent with a tombstone that would have been erected in 1840. So I feel pretty confident that this was erected, maybe not the same week that he died, but I feel confident that it is contemporary with his death in 1840. Now, comparing that to this rose granite tombstone, and we have Charles Scott II, born in 1786, died in 1857, and Susan McCullough Scott, born 1796 and died in 1855. First off, the rose granite, that's something that didn't become popular until the 1920s. But also looking at the writing, the style of writing, the font that's used, it's not something that was done. It's not a style that was used in the 1850s. So right there, I'm confident that this stone was not erected near the time of Charles and Susan's deaths. Another clue that you might have picked up on are the references to West Virginia. The latest date that we have on this tombstone is 1857. West Virginia didn't become a state until 1863. So, yet another clue that this is not contemporary to their deaths. And in fact, I did a little bit of research on this stone and found that descendants had erected this tombstone in the 1990s because the original tombstone had been vandalized. Now, this one looks like it was something, looks like a tombstone that could have been erected in 1823. It's the right color, but it's actually concrete, and the font definitely not something that was used in 1823. This is a replacement tombstone. When you're looking at tombstones, always, always, always read the entire tombstone, not just the front. Look at the front, say on this one where we have Charles slain, but also the back where we have his wife Nancy. When you have an obelisk tombstone like this, also read the sides. Not unusual at all to find children listed on the sides of the tombstone. And make sure you read it from top to bottom. Here we have a tombstone for Judson Osborne, but at the bottom of the tombstone, it's noted that it was erected by H.C. Hart and Sisters. I don't know who H.C. Hart and Sisters are, but I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for them in my research. So I want to talk briefly about some related collections that you will find on archives.com, such as the Veterans Burial Records. This is in our Death Records collection. And this collection is from the Department of Veterans Affairs and lists the burials in national cemeteries as well as some private cemeteries. So a great resource if you're looking for veterans. As is the collection American Battle Monument Commission Burial Records, which is in our military section. It's a listing of American servicemen who fought in World War I or World War II and were buried in AMBC cemeteries outside the United States. It also also includes those who are listed on the walls of the missing. If you're not looking for a veteran, try taking a look at the Billion Graves Burial Index, which you can also find on archives.com in the death records section. And just wanted to show you here real quickly a record from the Veterans Burial Records collection, where we have the veteran's name, his date of death, information about his service. We see here U.S. Army, Civil War, and that he's buried at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, along with an exact plot. So I could go to Jefferson Barracks Cemetery and go directly to his grave. I could also contact that cemetery to see if they have other information about Absalom Martin. Perhaps the regiment that he served in might be some information that the cemetery would have. Other related collections would be the Social Security Death Index, and obviously newspapers and obituaries. And just a reminder that when you're looking for newspapers on archives.com, go to the search page and select newspapers. And I encourage everyone to search by a range of dates. You want to make sure that you're getting all of the mentions of that person before and shortly after they died. So all sorts of good collections there. And you can also filter your search down to the exact newspaper if you'd like to. Next week on the archives.com live stream, what are you missing in the 1920 through 1940 censuses? Those are some great resources. Are you really getting everything out of them? And that's what we're going to talk about next Wednesday, May 29th at the same time, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog or liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, or going over to our YouTube channel where you can see the previous live streams that we've done. We've uploaded all of them there, and you can find them there on the YouTube channel. Obviously, if you are watching this later on YouTube, you've already discovered that. And I encourage you to pop over on Wednesdays and watch the live stream where you can also participate in the chat room. Speaking of the chat room, I will be there momentarily to answer any questions that you might have. And until next time, this is Amy Johnson Crow wishing you happy researching.